All right. Just start sharing my screen. Just a second. All right. So I should have named the presentation all about pipits, but I forgot about that. But this is so this is pipits in India. Essentially, we'll go through a series of slides that take you through all the species, as well as ways to ID them and what to look out for. And again, I think as a caveat, you'll notice that pipits are they're just difficult birds to ID, and I don't expect myself to ID them correctly about maybe at least 30% of the times. And when you look at pipits, you go through a bunch of features. You look through your knowledge of what time of the year you're at, where you're at, um, and go through, let's say, what you can see in the plumage. You listen to the call, and based on that, it's basically a game of probabilities. If most features align towards one species, it's likely to be that species, or it's something else. More often than not, in 90% of the country, no matter where you're situated, the pipit's a paddy field pipit. But the first question, I think, for most people is you try and identify whether it's a lark or a pipit. And certain larks, especially those such as the Oriental skylark over here, can look very similar to the pipits, simply because it's relatively slender. It's it's got a fine bill. It's got a slightly longer tail than usual, but most larks in general tend to be more heavily marked everywhere than pipits. They tend to have bigger bills. They have short tails. They're stouter, more compact. And while I've given here an example of an Oriental skylark, you'll know from seeing many other larks around you, you've got very flamboyant looking larks as well, right? From subtly flamboyant, like crested larks and all with the crest on top of the head, to things like sparrowlarks, rufous-tailed larks, horned larks, which just look very different to pipits in general. Pipits, on the other hand, tend to look more or less the same throughout the entire family. One of the easiest ways to tell apart larks from pipits, I find, is the way when you see them from a distance. It's just the way they move. And you'll notice, for example, this is a video of a paddy field pipit. It stops, looks for something, and then makes a dash again. They move really fast. Yeah, so something like that. And that's basically because not paddy field pipits, all pipits are insectivorous. So they tend to have that kind of a movement where they dart from one place to another, stopping at points to look for insects. Meanwhile, larks they're also insectivorous, but they're also seed eaters. So they feed on roots as well, seeds. There's actually documentation of larks feeding on small berries and things. But very often, larks look like this. This is a short-toed lark over here. And you'll notice its movements are more like that of a grazer, as opposed to a bird that's darting here and there looking for insects or catching or hunting insects. So when you are at a distance and looking through your binoculars or your camera at a brown streaky bird in a field, the movements of the birds is often the first clue towards whether it's a lark or a pipit. Right. Once you've gotten an idea of whether it's a lark or a pipit, and it's a pipit and not a lark, then you move on to what is it that you're supposed to look out for. In this set of slides, I'll first just take you through some of the features that you look at for pipits. For a lot of birds, you look at things like the vent, or let's say the color of the legs or the belly, but not so much in pipits. The ones at least I look for, just take you through them one by one. So there's the bill, which is, I think, when I actually see a pipit, the first thing I usually notice, apart from the structure, would be the bill, simply for the shape that it is and things like that, but we'll get to that. So there's the bills, there's the lores, there's the supercilium, there's the crown on top here, the supercilium being the eyebrow, The lores being this area between the eye and the bill. There's the nape. I probably didn't need to mention nape because you don't really look at it as much as you look at the mantle, which is essentially the area that, when you see streaking on a bird, you see the streaks going from the crown down to the back via the mantle. And the mantle is often a good clue of a number of things, and we'll come to that later as well. So that's the mantle. There's the back of the bird. There's the ear coverts, essentially the feathers that hide the ear of the bird, which is a tiny little hole over there. There's the median coverts. You see these feathers which are bordered, edged by white over here. Those are the median coverts around here. There are greater coverts, lesser coverts. But for pipits specifically, median coverts are a useful feature to look at. So these feathers are median coverts. We'll actually look at the edges of the feathers as well as, so the color on the edges, as well as the shape inside. And we'll come to that later, but generally the median coverts. There's the breast and the streaking on the breast that we look at. The tail, again, not always in most pipits, but in some pipits, the tail length in general, especially the proportion, the proportional length compared to the rest of the body can be quite important. And then there's the malar stripe. Most pipits have a malar stripe. There are some that don't. And for those, this is a pretty dead giveaway as to what species it might be. And the flanks, which actually is similar to the breast. You look at the breast streaking, and in some cases, you look at the streaking down the flanks. And we'll get to that later as well. And for maybe one or two pipits, you look at the color of the legs. And most importantly, you look at the overall structure of the bird. So this essentially will, what this basically means, you look at pretty much most of the body parts on a pipit before arriving at a decision as to what it is. But in general, in no particular order, the things I look for are the structure of the bird, the face pattern. So that includes the combination of, whether the lores are marked, whether they are pale, how long the supercilium is, does it appear to be starting before the eye, behind the eye. It could be the color of the ear coverts, how distinguishable they are, the presence of the malar stripe, things like that. There's the streaking, how heavily streaked is the back, how heavily streaked is the breast. The bill, again, like I said, the shape of the bill, the color of the bill in many cases. And in some cases, leg color can be important, although I wouldn't give too much weightage to it. What I would give weightage to is actually the call of the bird. If sometimes birds don't call, no worries. But if they do call, I think it's very important to familiarize yourself with the calls, at least for common species. Or even if you can just memorize the call or record the call, it's pretty useful, because actually nowadays you have resources online to just be able to compare the calls. Earlier, you probably have to find a way to transcribe the calls, but if you can record it on your cell phone or something and just compare it later on with what's available online, that's an easy way of finding out what pipit is. Most calls for pipits tend to be diagnostic, but not always. And the habitat, which is usually rather than an ID pointer at the time you're seeing the pipit, is something I would know beforehand. So if you're going to a really dry, arid place, you're looking, most likely you'll encounter paddy field pipits, tawny pipits, long-billed pipits. If you're going to a marshy grassland, you might encounter Richard's pipits, Blythe's pipits, paddy field pretty much everywhere, but you get the idea. And like I said, very few of these are actually diagnostic features. You use a combination of all these features that you notice before arriving at an identification. Right. So once you've seen a brown streaky bird, you figured out it's a pipit, you know what to look for. The next distinguishing factor that logically you would look at, and the more you practice, you wouldn't even know when you're going through these options, but the next thing you would look at is whether the pipit's a large pipit or a small pipit. And what that basically means is, as the name suggests, there's actually two groups of pipits, and they're not just on the basis of size. They're actually different groups on genetically speaking. So they lie within different clades on a family tree. So the large pipits include your pipits like Paddyfield, Tawny, Richards, Blights, Long-billed upland pipit. And they have, the plumage changes with age, but not with seasons. Unlike in small pipits, where not always, but in many of the smaller pipits, they have a distinct breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage. The flanks, except in one case, are never streaked for the large pipits, but they are streaked in most cases for small pipits. So in this case, this is a Paddyfield pipit. This is an olive back pipit. And as the name suggests, the larger pipits are generally bigger, smaller pipits are generally smaller, but it's not a rule of thumb. It's more of how these birds feel when you see them in the field. And generally speaking, large pipits like Paddyfield pipits and Richards pipits just feel a bit bigger than, let's say, tree pipits or Rosy Pipits in the field. I like to quickly take you through aging these birds, simply because if you noticed earlier, I mentioned the median coverts. Particularly for me, knowing what age the bird is at, it's pretty useful. So for example, what time of the year I'm looking at, I know what kind of streaking to expect on, let's say, the resident species, which is Paddyfield pipit, or how much white to expect on the median coverts. And this knowledge helps me in figuring out whether the pipit I'm looking at is a Blythe's pipit or a Paddyfield pipit, or if I'm seeing what I think is a Blythe's pipit, which is supposed to have white wing bars, I can hold myself back and be like, oh, let's say it's autumn, so Paddyfield pipits would also have the white on the median coverts, or Richards pipits would also have the white on the median coverts, and they would also be heavily streaked, and so on and so forth. So generally, aging is a very useful thing to know about when it comes to pipits. Again, one of the things about India, and especially with Paddyfield pipits, is they breed at different times of the year across the subcontinent. But usually it's between April and August, I would say. So where I normally watched Paddyfield pipits nesting, I've seen fledglings in let's say May end in Manipal, as well as in August end. So they're clearly the big breeding season. Most juveniles, such as this one here, these are Paddyfield pipits again. Most juveniles look like this. They're very heavy scales, scaled kind of look on the top, which can look like very heavy streaking. And a lot of people actually confuse these birds, especially, they'll look at these birds, they'll find them often in September or August, or, just before the start of the monsoon, around late April, maybe May. And are likely to ID them for things like Richards pipit or Blythe's pipit. But it's important to keep in mind that such heavy scaling is completely perfect and sign of juvenile Paddyfield pipit. Other juvenile pipits also have this kind of scaling, but we don't find them in our country, thankfully. Otherwise, it would be really difficult. So if you're likely to see this kind of a bird, it's likely to be a juvenile pipit, especially in the middle of the monsoons or the middle of the summer. Coming into autumn, you'll notice they molt really quickly. They have a much more mottled back and crown. Again, the example is with Paddyfield pipits, but holds true for pretty much all pipit species except for Blythe's in the large pipits group. So there's still heavy remnants of the streaking all over. It looks more mottled though, much more worn out. And you'll notice that the median coverts now get fringed by the white edges. Usually, most birds at this time of the year retain the yellow gape, but it's not a very reliable characteristic, because a lot of adult birds I've seen which have been nesting and have chicks and all also have slight yellow gapes still remaining as remnants of that plumage. I don't know why that is. For example, this bird here, which is carrying nesting material, also has the yellow gape. And usually, birds coming from juvenile plumage to first winter and going through the winter basically can look around this much, give or take a bit of streaking, and add a bit of buff to the median coverts later in the season. And coming into spring, most of them would have molted a fair bit, would have got plainer backs, some crown streaking still there. And a few feathers on the median coverts might be fringed with buff, might be fringed with white, but you'll see usually it's one or the other, and often a mixture of the two. And this is the summer, and coming out to the summer is when all these pipits shed all their feathers and go into a full molt. Before that, though, they're at their most worn out stage, and that's also the time when they show these classic pale lores. So you'll notice how the lores actually change or are really variable for these birds. Often in the most worn plumage, you'll see pale lores. You'll see very, very pale streaking, vague streaking, or sometimes no streaking at all, even on the breast and on the back. So a lot of people can easily mistake these for one of the pale lored pipits, such as Richards or Blythes, or on the other hand, even for something like Tawny, even though that would have much more strongly marked lores. Another thing worth noting is, before I move on, is look at the size of the hind claws, because I know a lot of people put a lot of weight on the hind claws. I don't, but I'll get to that later anyway. And so this is basically an adult pipit out of its that autumn cycle of the full molt, basically. And this is what I think, at least, a typical paddy field pipit should look like. Nice buffy edges to the median coverts, a distinct lower stripe, a dual toned bill with a curved culmen, and some hints of streaking down the crown and down the back, and then on the mantle. So basically, you find paddy field pipits all across the country, especially common even in the northeast. They're found all along the ghats, on top of the ghats, along the coast. So yeah, basically, if you're looking for a paddy field pipit, expect them every single place that you're going to. So with a paddy field pipit, it's pretty important to familiarize yourself for that reason. In any difficult species group in general, it's very, very important to familiarize yourself with the commonest or the most likely of those species. So, for example, in Delhi, it would be the chiffchaff or the Hume's warbler for warblers, greenish warblers in South India. You would want to familiarize yourself with shikras if you're interested in accipiters. Similarly, for pipits, it'll have to be paddy field pipit. If you know your paddy field pipits, every time you don't see one, or every time you see something more interesting, you'll know it, as long as you're very, very good with your paddy field pipits. So, and pipits have this capacity to surprise you all the time. So it's always fun to look at paddy field pipits, simply because of how varied they can actually be. But some things remain constants, and I'll go through them here. So the first thing I look for is the structure. Paddy field pipits are really compact pipits. So they appear like they have big heads compared to the rest of their body in proportion. They have short tails. So it becomes like a very compact pipit simply because of the short tail and the big head feature. The bill is actually quite distinct for paddy field pipits. So it tends to be dual toned with a very distinct yellow base to the lower mandible, and the upper mandible curves at the end at the culmen. So there's a very curved tip to the culmen, and you'll see pretty much all paddy field pipits almost always show this feature. So you'll see here, or in all of these birds, they have that dual tone bill with the curved culmen, even in juveniles. The streaking in paddy field pipits tends to be, like we went through the cycles again, except in really worn out birds, there'll always be some hint of the streaking, which can appear really strong depending on how fresh the plumage is, to fairly vague depending on how worn out the plumage is. But the one thing I look for is in the streaking, there's streaking on the crown, and then there's streaking on the back, and there tends to be a very distinct break in the streaking on the mantle over here. It usually tends to be a very clean mantle. Same thing with as we went through the slides earlier, same thing with the lores. Most pipits will show a fine loral stripe, but there are cases where a paddy field pipit might not really show a loral stripe at all. The call of the, oh wait, hang on, sorry, before I move on, again, there's a median coverts. median coverts tend to have the shape of the patterns within median coverts. They'll have more weightage when we look at Blythe's pipits and Richard's pipits. But just in case, you can see how there's a triangular shape, but it's fairly vague, and either extreme of the two might mean something else other than a paddy field pipit. But anything that looks similar to this would normally not eliminate a paddy field pipit based on that feature. So you're looking at the structure and the shape. Then I'm looking at the facial features. I'm looking at the streaking, stopping over here. I'm looking at glancing maybe at the median coverts. Won't give it too much weightage. I also look at the way the ear coverts are generally enclosed in a paddy field pipit. It's pretty neatly done in most paddy field pipits because of the line here and the mustachial stripe that's going all the way around to the ear coverts. And then, of course, the call tends to be diagnostic if you know what you're looking for. So I'll just take you through that. So one call here is this one, the CC. I'll stop there. But then the other call, so there's that call, the TC, which reminds me of like a white wagtail, if you've heard that call, the two notes. And then there's a single noted chip, 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 chip calls, which is fairly distinctive, but there's a couple of other species that make similar calls. The paddy field pipit, especially in around the breeding months and maybe even late winter, you'll actually see them display, and they have a very, very pretty display in that they take to the wing, go up, not very high up in the sky, and then flutter down, kind of like Oriental skylarks. So it's not, they don't really hover, but they fly, and they fly in that weird fluttering flight. It's quite pretty, and that's their flight song. Usually when you're hearing that song, it's quite likely that there's no other species of pipits around anyway. But I have heard paddy field pipits singing as early as February and even late Jan, when the field was filled with Blythe's and Richard's pipits as well. So nonetheless, just useful to know. The next pipit we'll speak about is actually the Richard's pipit, of which earlier Richard's pipit was considered this one massive complex that's spread from Africa across Asia down to Australia. And paddy field pipit was part of that complex, but they've been split now. So this is a very difficult group of birds, and they all look really alike. The pipit I see in Australia, called the Australian pipit, which actually has streaked flanks, was also considered a Richard's pipit. But Richard's pipit, especially the subspecies that comes to India, I think there's two subspecies. I forgot the one which is the one that comes to India, but there's another one called sinensis in Southeast China, which when I first saw one, I actually thought it was a paddy field pipit because it's so much smaller. But luckily, I don't think those have been recorded in India yet. And the subspecies we get in India tends to be this large bird that you can see over here. Richard's pipits, again, the first thing I would look at is the structure and the shape. And if you're tuned into it, you'll notice straight away how different they are to a paddy field pipit. It's a much bigger bird. And because it's so big, it appears very small-headed and very longer, and has a much longer tail. So the tail, for example, in this case, is probably more than half the size of the body, and the head appears very small, which also gives the overall look to the body this appearance of it being pot-bellied, and so it looks very round. And you know how they say how Richard's pipits stand upright? So when they stand upright, that's when that belly is actually most apparent, and it sticks out like that. Maybe another example of that somewhere. So you look at the structure, which is essentially, it's a very big bird, small-headed, long-tailed, has a similar bill to a paddy field pipit. More often than not, probably almost every time, it'll be dual toned. So it'll have that yellow base to the bill, as well as the curved culmen. So very similar to the paddy field pipit in that sense. And you'll notice that there are pale lores. I'll come to that later. So Richard's pipit theoretically should always show pale lores, but lores can get very tricky because lores kind of change with angles. And I actually found a video to illustrate the same, and we'll go through it then. But generally speaking, if you want to see whether the lores are marked or pale, the true representation is only what you see in the side profile. Because all pipits, when you look at them head on, look like they have marked lores, and when you look at them from the back, they look like they have pale lores, and only from the side do you know whether if the lores are pale or marked. But nonetheless, it's an important feature, especially for Richard's pipits and Blythe's pipits, to separate from paddy field, is that they will almost always have pale lores, which also gives this appearance of the supercilium starting behind the eye. So if you look at the paddy field pipit, the supercilium starts where you would think it starts in most birds. But in Richard's pipit, it looks like it starts from behind the eye. And we'll see the same feature in Blythe's pipits. Now for the median coverts, again, this is a younger bird, as you can tell by the white fringing to the median coverts. But you can see the really pointy centers to the median coverts. And again, it's something that's very hard to tell in the field, and I personally don't really look at it much unless it's very obvious. But worth noting, especially if you see really triangular median coverts, then you know it's not a paddy field, it's more likely to be a Richards. The streaking on the crown, in this case, goes all the way down to the back, and unlike the paddy field pipit, there's barely any break in the mantle. Most birds won't show clear streaking going all the way down. They'll show like these clear streaks on the crown, clear streaks on the back, and this weird kind of mottling on the mantle. But that itself is also a very good giveaway that it might be a Richards or a Blythe's pipit, or at least it might not be a paddy field pipit. I'll quickly take you to a video of a Richards pipit. So before I continue, I think the bird calls in here a few times, but just things to note are, look at how big and broad that tail is. Richard's pipits do have really long hind claws, and it's as an absolute, sorry, I'll wait for this to go away. As an absolute measurement, those hind claws are actually longer than paddy field pipit, but in terms of proportions, proportionally, they seem very the same length as a paddy field pipit's long claws would on a paddy field pipit's body. So it's usually a very good idea to, it's only a good idea to actually look at the claws if you're seeing a paddy field pipit side by side, or if you have the bird in hand. But hind claws just by themselves are not a great way of identifying pipits. So that's a very harsh call of a Richards pipit, the sheep. If you're familiar, especially I know in the Delhi wetlands, when you're familiar with things like citrine wagtails, they actually have a very similar call to that of the citrine wagtail in some ways, that harsh sheep kind of thing. I can't do it, in fact. Or if you listen to it, it actually kind of sounds like a sparrow, like a male sparrow, especially on top of a perch when it sings. A sheep kind of sound. Yeah, so note here especially, so when it looks away from you, it has pale lores. And then when it looks to the side, it has pale lores, and then looks at you, it's got marked lores. So just on the way it faces you, the impression of whether the lores are marked or whether they're completely pale keeps changing. And that is why it's a very risky ID feature just by itself. Again, the lores become marked. They were pale here, and then suddenly they become heavily marked like this. One thing I would look at again is the crown streaking over here, the mottle streaking on the mantle, and then again streaks resuming on the back. I think that's all there is to this video. Yeah. Okay. Um, so that's the call of the bird. I'll play it again, actually, a more distinct recording. So worth noting is, compared to a paddy field pipet, which the notes would almost be chup or chup chup or thisip thisip kind of notes, the Richard's pipet's notes are just a long shriek. And just note the quality of the call, because it's really harsh. And once you get familiar with that quality, then it's a really sure short way of identifying. If you see a pipet making that call, there's nothing else that really comes to mind which makes a similar call. There is something, maybe a tawny pipit has something similar in its repertoire, but the habitat for both of them is so different, they very rarely co-occur. So that's the call of the bird. With behavior, again, a lot of literature, actually I don't know if it's literature, I've just heard that if it's a very erect bird, it should be a Richard's pipit. um, I've never found that feature very useful in the field. One of the reasons is because Richard's pipits, they really like dense fields and dense grassy areas to move about in. So very rarely, so you don't get to see them really well to start with. And when you do see them, that feature itself is the only time when you see their heads poking out of the grass or something of that sort. So it's usually the call that's the first indicator. And when it comes to behavior, their flight pattern. So their flight pattern is really undulating. If you're familiar with the flight pattern of, let's say, a woodpecker, where it flaps, goes up, it drops down, goes up, drops down. It's very similar to that, actually, or even I wouldn't say a thrush exactly, actually, but it's just a very undulating, a very heavy. It gives you that feeling of being a very heavy bird, especially when it's coming down in that flight path. Um, Also, when it goes into land, into the grass. So in Manipal, where I used to see these birds very, very often, they're a very common wintering migrant in one of the fields that I used to frequent. Um, one of one of the dead giveaways for it being a Richard's pipit would be that when it would fly and it would land into the grass, just before landing into the grass, it would flutter its wings really, really fast and appear as if it was hovering for a short while. But it literally looks like this really heavy pipet dropping down and then opening a parachute and then slowly dropping into the grass. And so it's a very cool looking thing that way. And it's very distinctive once you get used to that. So actually, if you see a lot of paddy field pipets dropping down, the next time you see a Richard's pipet dropping down, you'll be like, oh, this is something different altogether. And habitat, like I mentioned, it prefers wet areas, generally denser grassy fields, and things like that. Yeah, like I would expect Richard's pipits to be, where I would see Richard's pipits in, let's say, Manipal. Again, I say Manipal again, because that's where I have the most experience with these birds. But even in the Northeast, actually, I would expect to see snipes in the same field. So you expect that, mud to be damp, grasses to be thick enough, and they really like hiding into those kind of areas. Um, okay, so with Richard's pipits, I I suppose they're pretty common all across the Northeast. Not pretty common, but they're regular along the Northeast. I find them to be quite regular along the western coast of India. Um, and I know there have been recent records in Peninsular India in general. Around Delhi, they seem to be not that common. I know Dadri used to have birds regularly through the winter. The Dadri wetlands just south of Noida. And I know Kavi photographed this beautiful looking Richard's pipit from somewhere near Gurgaon recently. So they're definitely about, but I've never seen them in great numbers in Delhi. And they might be more of a passage migrant as they go back to their wintering grounds in the Northeast. So breeding grounds um, in North China, and especially towards the eastern side of Russia and those areas. Okay. Oh, well, we've seen the Richard Pipit video. So there's that. Here's another really beautiful Richard Pipit. I'll just quickly run down. This is an adult because the earlier bird we were seeing was actually a juvenile, well, a first winter kind of bird with those white fringes here. But this is like a full adult Richard Pipit. You can see the completely pale lores. You can see the dual tone bill with the curved culmen streaking down the back. This is quite worn out, actually, this bird. So the streaking is really vague, but nonetheless, you can see that mottling through here all the way down. Um, I really like this photo simply because of how big this bird is. This is a very small-headed bird. Um, has a it almost gives you the feeling of being a thrush. But even though in this, so we'll come to, for example, long-bill pipit, which could even be a thrush for all I know. But it's obviously a pipit. But Richard's pipits in photos can give you the feeling of being a thrush, but it looks like a thrush-sized pipit. So in the field, when you look at it, it feels distinctly like a pipit, just a very big one. And look at those median coverts, just triangular and pointy all the way through. Yeah. So this is again where I used to see the birds in Manipal. So that's a paddy field pipit, and that's a Richard's pipit. And that the size difference really just comes through in this photograph. They were perched on top of each other, and if you just look at the massive tail, the pale lores, the small head compared to the small tail, and the much more compact build of the paddy field pipit, is really different. This particular bird had massive hind claws, which I think does not do justice to the paddy field pipit's long claws. Some of them can be pretty long, but I mean that's pretty much at the extreme length for a Richard's pipit. Um, and I think especially when they're perched on a wire is the only time where I've seen that erect stance really stand out. So for a paddy field pipit in a similar stance, it still feels very horizontal, and the Richard seems quite upright and gives you that appearance of having a belly. I think both of them have it, but I think the Richards, at least to my eyes, looks like it always has that because it's standing, like really upright and has that bulge coming through. Just to give you an idea of all these flocks of birds of Richard's pipits that we would see. Oh, geez, sorry, let's go straight up. Yeah, so all of these birds are actually Richard's pipits, except for white-browed wagtail over here and a white-browed wagtail over here. But all of these are Richard's pipits, and even in these silhouettes, you can make out that long tail, the small head, and that really upright stance with the belly sticking out. So even from this distance, even though it's a really crappy photo, I agree. You can kind of tell that these are not your regular paddy field pipits. All right. Cool. So this is where we are. Yep. And so the next pipit, a Blythe's pipit. Blythe's pipits, I actually think, and I think most people who are familiar with this pipit will don't find them as confusing as they should be, because they do look superficially very similar to paddy field and Richard's pipits, but they've got subtle differences in the field which really make them stand out, or even in photographs which really make them stand out. So one of the things with Blythe's pipit is you rarely ever find a bird with anything on the lores. And they have the palest lores of the three pipits, and so the supercilium tends to distinctly stand out and start from the back. But one of the things I find when I look at a Blythe's pipit is even though in terms of size, is paddy field pipit smaller than Blythe's pipit, which is smaller than Richard's pipit in that order. Blythe's pipit, I think it's because of these thick undertail coverts, or maybe that really fine bill. It gives me the impression of looking at a small pipit, something like a tree pipit. And I don't know why that is, but at least that's how I feel when I see a Blythe's pipit in the field. It never gives me the same impression as a Richards or a paddy field does of being one of the bigger pipits. But in any case, in Blythe's pipit, the thing that stands out for me is so it's that overall shape that sort of gives me the feel of a small pipit. The bill tends to not have the yellow at the base at all, so it'll be a dark pinkish tone. think that's what's supposed to be. But to me, basically, the bill appears darkish, um, and much finer, much more. The culmen over here is much more flat, much flatter than the Paddyfield or the Richards Pipit. The supercilium distinctly starts behind the eye, and so it gives their face a very neat look with that mustache, kind of coming through. And I find if you see me, they're my favorite pipits by far, and it's because they just look really cute. With that, I think it's got something to do with the face. It's a very neat little head. They look really gentle. Um, and so you see the supercilium, you see the pale lores, supercilium behind the eye, the fine bill, and the pale fringed um, median coverts that stick throughout the plumage. So even adults have them. So especially if you're seeing birds later in the winter, after January, let's say, and if they still have these distinctive wing bars, then they're very likely to be Blythe's pipits, because that's when I would expect Paddyfield and Richards pipits, the first winter Paddyfield and Richards, to have lost those white edged median coverts. Sorry. The streaking. Yeah, so Blythe's pipits. Okay, the other thing about Blythe's pipit, the plumage in general, is that they're really pale. It doesn't, again, it's one of those features. I think when you see the bird, and especially if you're in a kind of habitat where you've been seeing Paddyfield pipits, you see a Blythe's pipit and it strikes you as something that's really pale. And I think especially when you see the streaking on the bird, it's really strong. It really appears very strong. So again, coming down from the crown, down the mantle into the back, which is very similar. I mean, that's nothing new. Even Richard Pipit has it, but it just appears really strong. And I think that's because the streaking itself is fringed by these pale areas, the pale plumage, pale brown kind of color, as opposed to the colder brown and the warmer tones of the Paddyfield and the Richards Pipits. So to me, at least, Blythe's Pipit strikes out as this really pale bird with dark streaking on it, as opposed to a very brown pipit with dark streaking on it, if that makes sense. Again, in these two birds, you can see the very distinctly pale lores, the darkish bill, very fine bill, and especially this bird looks really cute. Um, um, Again, I find that Blythe's pipits are, I think they're pretty common all along this part of India and even inside. And I'll tell you why. I see Blythe's pipits in general, unlike Richard's pipits, they seem to prefer drier areas. I expect they occur in these open laterite patches, often right next to tawny pipits at times in their winter grounds in Manipal, for example. But that doesn't mean they're averse to wet areas. I have found them in wet areas as well, in marshes as well. But they obviously have a broader range of habitat preferences as compared to Richard's pipits. So, for example, places where I've seen them is all around this area. Seen a bunch of them in the northeast. Seen them in the Terai, and I've seen them at the Sultanpur Flats. The kind of place where I would normally not expect Richard's pipits, but where you have tawny, you've got Paddyfield, and around that area where you have some water and some grasses, so not completely barren open land. As long as there's some cover, you'll often find Blythe's pipits. Okay, I just play the call of the bird as well. So again, it's a dead giveaway, the call of a Blythe's pipit. That explosive spew, spew, spew. That's the Blythe's pipit. It can sound superficially really similar to a Richard's pipit. So that's Richard's and that's Blythe's. But that major difference being, Blythe's doesn't have that jarring quality, the sheep, it has spew, the quality that a Richards has. And once you've got to grips with that aspect of a Blythe's pipit, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. This is something I learned from Per Alstrom in his talk at Chambal, that when a Blythe's pipit lands, it gives out these chup 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 notes. I haven't actually heard that as often as I'd like to, but um, it does seem to happen every now and then. And when it does give those, they go chew, chew, chew as it flies. So it'll fly again in that undulating flight, but nowhere near as heavy as a Richard's Pipit. Um, just before landing, it'll often give those chip, 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 chip kind of notes, or just after taking off, after the first few spew sounds, it'll give the chip, chip, chip and continue flying off. The other thing I noticed with Blythe's pipits is they prefer cover, so they'll often stay in dense vegetation, but they will very often come out on these little rocks or little perches and have a look around. They don't look as erect as a Richards or a paddyfield pipit can, but they often like to come out and have a look and then go back in again. Not sure how useful that is in all habitats, but definitely the group of pipits I've seen, that seems to be the case very often. In fact, I remember one of the pipits that I was seeing on my way to Bangalore somewhere. I got onto a bunch of Blythe's pipits in a field, and they would often get onto these little bunds by the side of the fields, and get up and then go back down again and keep going, which is something I haven't seen very often in other pipits. Right, so that's the paddyfield pipit, Richard's pipit, an adult Blythe's pipit, all three are adults. And in short, if you want to take, I haven't put anything in behavior because there was way too much to put in, and but in short, essentially these are the differences between the three pipits. I've gone through most of them. What I would just like remind people is that paddyfield, as you can see over here, also looks very compact compared to the other two. Richards looks massive. Blythe's just looks really neat. Such a handsome bird. Although I might be biased. In this case especially, you notice the squarish median coverts of the Blythe's pipits. They really stand out. Actually, I should show you that. So the white fringes makes it appear that it has wing bars, gives it the appearance of having wing bars on the median coverts. And also just the edges. It's very hard to actually, I can draw this for you. So when I say median coverts being pointy or being, so, basically this is what a Blythe's pipit has. And this is what a Richard's pipit has. And somewhere in the middle is where the paddyfield pipit is, something like that. And it ranges all over the place. But when I say, when people say squarish centers to the center of the median coverts, you can see there's a distinct pointy tip over here and over here. But it's actually the edges leading up to that pointy tip which are squarish. And it's these pointy bits in a Richard's pipit which are pointy. So these squarish bits are often missing. But yeah, worth looking at if you've got enough a good view of the pipits, or if a good photograph actually. Right, you can take a screenshot of this if you want, but we've pretty much been through this, and I'll continue on. So Nick actually photographed this bird in Sultanpur, and I think it was at the time ID'd as Richards or something, but I find this really interesting. And you can see that it has, this bird has a long tail and is quite well streaked, has those pointy median coverts also, and it's amazing. But it's actually a tawny pipit. It's a juvenile tawny pipit, which quite remarkably, especially if you don't get a good view of the lores, is fairly heavily streaked all throughout from the crown down to the back. Has that proportions which are fine for a Richard's pipit. And if you see it in an odd kind of place, like next to a water body or something, can easily, I think, is actually a better fit. Is more likely to be mistaken for a Richard's pipit than anything else. And in fact, I think juvenile tawny pipits are more like Richard's pipits than paddyfield pipits are like Richard's pipits, if that makes sense. So just something to be wary of. Well, we've moved on to tawny pipits. Tawny pipits, this is a young bird, so you can see the rufous. So the things I would look out for here to tell apart this bird from a Richard's pipit would be the bill, which is mostly dark. There's no yellow to the base of the bill. It's a mostly flat culmen. There's the dark lores. There's rufous ear coverts, which I think is an age-based feature of a tawny pipit, but I'm not entirely sure of that. But most juvenile or first winter birds that I've seen in tawny pipits tend to have these rufous tones to the ear coverts. And the overall look. So if you imagine this bird in a silhouette, at least when I do, it gives me the impression of being a wagtail. Um, and that's often the case of um, in tawny pipits. They're actually really long-tailed, um, and but they never give you the appearance of being erect like paddy field pipits or Richard's pipits do. They often hold themselves very horizontally, and when you see them in the field and they're running about, they're so horizontal. Like the first thing I think of is something like a yellow wagtail or a white wagtail in a brown plumage. But this is a very typical looking tawny pipit. Um, a nice bill, which is mostly dark. This one actually has a palish base to it, so can be confused. But most of them, I think, don't. Um, there's a flatter culmen compared to Richards and Paddyfield. Barely any streaking on the back, barely any streaking on the front, and overall a very plain brown pipit. But to me, what really stands out is the structure of the bird. So that long tail, that horizontal stance, that fine bill. Overall, a very slender, almost wagtail pipit, which is a compliment to it, I think. The call of the tawny pipit is actually a bit confusing because it has those chup chup notes that a Blythe's pipit and Paddyfield pipit has, but it also has harsher sheep notes of the Blythe's and the Richards pipit, and very like the saving grace for for IDing this bird is that at least in 90% of situations where you find tawny pipits, you will not find the other two because of its preference for this habitat, which is completely dry and barren usually, with some grassy cover here and there. So Sultanpur flats is again a very good place to see them, as is anywhere in the northwest of the country. Um, just play the call for you. So that sheep is actually is a tawny pipit, and I'm not sure if I can always tell apart a Blythe's from a tawny, for example, when I hear them together. Yeah, but again, normally the habitat where you are can give you a clue as to whether it's a tawny or not, simply because they prefer they really stay away from wet habitats or dense grass. So all of this area um, in the Deccan, Gujarat, of course. So all of these are actually really good places in India for tawny pipits. Okay. So we were drawing. Okay. Again, more tawny pipits. There's again you can see the clean breast, the clean back, marked floral stripe. So that impression it gives of this very horizontal bird. Nice fine bill here. This might be a younger bird, I suspect, with the rufous tones to the ear coverts, but I'm not entirely sure because the rest of the plumage seems to be fairly adult. I'm biased towards being an adult. Yeah. Another interesting bird, very dark lores, very plain back, very slightly marked breast, which is a giveaway, and the bill you can see a distinct yellow base to the bill and the curved culmen, and the short tail. So this is a kind of bird that can easily be mistaken for a tawny pipit, but this in this case is a paddy field pipit, also from Sultanpur Flats, where you're likely to see tawny pipits. So there's always that element of you can get them wrong. There's no harm, there's no shame in that. Um, the next bird I would come to is actually the long-billed pipit. So this is the subspecies we normally see in North India, which can be mistaken simply because of how pale it is at times for a tawny pipit. But you'll notice a very nice, strong, broad tail, a much larger bill with a distinct dual tone nature to it, and the curve to the culmen, as well as a very strong supercilium, apart from just having the strong eye line. I find that yesterday Martin in his wobbler talk mentioned how Orphean wobblers in books look very similar to lesser white throats, and it's kind of true. In theory, long-billed pipits look very similar to tawny pipits, but when you see one, it's just such a large pipit. It's in a league of its own, and it reminds me of a thrush. And it's a very big pipit, and you wouldn't mistake it. When you see one, oh, I'm looking at something that's actually just a very large pipit. I think I like this photo because it represents a very pale long-billed pipit, and I wonder if it's one of the races that breeds in Iran and Pakistan. I think Decapitus. While this race seems to be Jerdani, which breeds in the Indian Himalayas. This was taken in Gujarat. But again, you can see compared to it's just such a big bird and such a with darker tones compared to a tawny pipit, let's say. So the structure and shape are very obvious. The massive bill is pretty obvious to me, with the culmen and the yellow at the base. There's not much to speak of in the plumage. This bird is actually the endemic subspecies, the nominate subspecies, which is Anthus similis, is the long-billed pipit, and this is the Anthus similis similis. It's probably the most Indian pipit because it's endemic, this subspecies, to India, and it's so disjointed from the overall population of long-billed pipit that I wonder if it could even be a different species altogether. The call, I don't have a recording, but the ones I've heard are normally chup, 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 kind of calls, very similar to some of the others you've heard before. But in the right habitat for long-billed pipit is quite unmistakable, especially if you've seen the bird. So long-billed pipits in North India, the wintering pipits seem to prefer these flat, dry, open, arid places, very similar to what tawny pipit likes. So they often coexist. Like Run of Kutch, or again Sultanpur Flats is one of those places. Most of Haryana, especially around Hisar and those areas, Tal Chapar, all those areas are really good for long-billed pipits. But especially down south, they prefer these really rocky, boulderish country where you hardly ever find any other pipit except for maybe paddy field, where they're easy to tell apart. You will find the odd tawny, but again, these birds are so different looking, especially in South India, the resident subspecies with the really dark tones, that they're quite easy to tell. So you've got the subspecies that breeds across, so that breeds across the Himalayas. I think it's this range over here, that's Jerdani, and then the same species is the one that winters in most of the places. There is the one that breeds somewhere in Pakistan and Iran, and that also supposedly comes to India. But these Decapitus and Jerdani, they look fairly similar. And then there's the subspecies that breeds in the Deccan. So there's, I think, a population here around Pune, and then there's a population around Bangalore. I'm not sure if there's anything in the middle, so sorry about that one. And that's Similis, that's the nominate subspecies. And then there's the really enigmatic one, which I haven't actually seen yet, in Kerala, in the high Western Ghats of Kerala, called Travancorensis, which is completely disjointed. It's found in the higher Western Ghats, in the Shola grasslands and things. It's pretty cool. That's one of these. This is the one from Kerala Western Ghats, and it's a juvenile bird. But yeah, won't spend too much time on this. As you can see, this is an upland pipit. This is the only large pipit with the streaks down the flanks, as you can see. Looks nothing like any of the other pipits we have seen. It's got a very distinctive seesawing sound. If you've been to the Himalayas about 2,000 meters in the right season, usually around March to May, especially even June, if you go to these, like Pangot, Vinayak, or even around, Chakori, was it? That had lots of these grasslands along the hillsides, and you often hear the chee-shoo, 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 and that's a sure shot sign of a plant pipit being there. Really good habitat for these kind of birds, and they prefer these grassy slopes with rocky outcrops and things like that. But I've seen them in steppe fields and areas also, actually. But a very distinctive bird, very heavily streaked above and below, and it has that look, very strong, tough pipit kind of look to it. I won't go into much details about this. It's about the size of a paddy field pipit, and is found across the western Himalayas. It's actually not found in the eastern Himalayas at all. So it's kind of like a western Himalayan endemic almost. Ooh, I should remove that. Sorry. Okay, so that's another pipit that's often reminds me of an upland pipit. This is the Nilgiri Whippet, and for the longest time I thought actually upland pipit and Nilgiri Whippet must have something in common, but apparently they don't. They're in fact quite different. Nilgiri Whippet is a small pipit, It sits in a different clade altogether. Again, a very distinctive bird, very range restricted, found in the higher Nilgiris and the mountains around, the high Shola grassland around Munnar and those parts of Kerala. And again, heavily streaked above and below. I find it very distinctive and very different to other pipits because of the lack of the mela stripe or a prominent mela stripe. So it feels like it's forgotten some piece of clothing that all the other pipits have, but this guy doesn't. They're often found in, they're found in these grasslands and tea plantations and all these areas, and they have this distinctive habit of flying up on top of a bush and then just sitting there and waiting until somebody goes off, and they go back into cover after that. Again, not spending too much time here simply because there isn't much to say in terms of identification. It's just an interesting little bird. And if you're fond of pipits and if you're going into where they are, even if you're not a twitcher or anything, just try and get a look at it. It's a really cool bird overall. Again, just found in these patches down south and restricted to that. It's a Western Ghats endemic, a very cool bird that way. Moving on. Whew. These are tough ones to tackle now again. So we're in the small pipit category. The two small pipits that are really similar and can be a source of confusion are the tree pipits and olive-backed pipits. I'll start with tree pipit. But I won't go through all the points with an olive-backed pipit because structurally they're very similar. So they are small pipits. They have like short tails, very fine bills, and when you see them, they appear very petite. They are very cute in the sense of their size, although not the same kind of cute as the gentle look of a Blythe's pipit projects. But a tree pipit and olive-backed pipit, they're very small. They have these. They're quite flighty. They normally they go up to trees and wires and things like that for a perch, hence the name, I suppose, because they do nest on the ground otherwise. In fact, the olive-backed pipit is called the Indian tree pipit, so you can see the similarities. Again, so what I look at over here is general shape and structure. It's a small, compact pipit with streaking going all the way down the flanks. And the call for both olive-backed and tree pipits is this high kind of sound, and I can't tell them apart in the field, and I don't think many people can. But there are cues you can in their behavior that you can actually look at instead. So I'll go straight to that right now. So with tree pipit, sorry. Yeah, okay, wait. Yeah, so I'll go into the, oh, wait, okay, sorry. I'll just wait till the olive-backed pipit actually to do this. With the tree pipit, what I look for to distinguish between olive-backed and tree pipit is, as the name suggests, olive-backed has an olive wash to the back. Tree pipit has a very brown back overall. But the trick to differentiating between the two really lies in looking at the face. So they're very short superciliums and are generally a very clean face. There's not much happening in the face. There are hints of little black dots, a little white patch over here, which look like remnants of what an olive-backed pipit will have, which I'll get to later. But generally, there's a short supercilium, very clean face, and dark streaking on the back, as you can see over here. When you see this pipit from the back, a lot of people, and I've received photos from people saying that they've got Blythe's pipits, which is completely acceptable because, Blythe's pipits have that nature about them, which they look like small pipits and they have those squarish median coverts with the white fringes, can appear like they have pale lobes from the back. But always worth looking at the streaking, which is a dead giveaway that it's not a Blythe's pipit. But to tell apart from an olive-backed pipit, I would look at the face, I would look at the color of the back and the streaking on the back. With some caveats, we'll get to that later. This is an olive-backed pipit. As you can see, there's a lot more happening on the face. There's a little black dot here, which is followed by a white here, and the white and black patch on the ear coverts and a long supercilium. The back is has an olive wash to it. And when you look at this bird from the back, like this one here, you'll notice that the streaking is almost non-existent compared to a tree pipit, where the streaking is very obvious and heavy. Now, there are two subspecies of an olive-backed pipit. So there's the one that breeds far north, Mongolia, Russia, all those places, and that's actually the widespread wintering species in India. and is the one you're most likely to encounter in the plains. That's the Yunanensis subspecies of olive-backed pipit. And the nominate subspecies is the Hodgsoni, which breeds across the Himalayas and goes into the northeastern, the countries bordering the northeast part of the state, sorry, the northeastern states as well. And that actually has dark streaks on the back. So in that case, you can throw that back pattern out the window and focus more on the facial pattern. But luckily, this subspecies that breeds in the Himalayas, the Hodgsoni subspecies, it doesn't winter far into the plains. So normally you would expect them maybe in Terai around Corbett, that kind of elevation in the winters. But very similar in terms of the back pattern to a tree pipit, and I would rely heavily on the facial pattern when I would see these birds. I'd like to show you a whip. So one of the things that both these olive-backed pipit and tree pipits do is they get onto a perch, they pump their tails like this, and it's really cool because no other pipit does it, but it's kind of like a wagtail sitting on a tail with wagtail with a very tiny tail. Have a look. So this is an olive-backed pipit, and does this constantly pumps its tail, and when it gets more agitated, it just pumps faster. This is from the back, so you can see this is the Yunanensis subspecies with a very clean back. And they are very adept at walking on trees. Both tree pipits and olive-backed pipits walk really well on branches like this. So that tail pumping is a very good giveaway that this is, or if you're seeing a bird on a wire, if it's pumping its tail, it's likely to be a tree or an olive-backed pipit. They're found all over the place really, so I wouldn't mess around with this map. Pretty much the entire peninsula is where tree pipits and olive-backed pipits winter. But one thing I will do is is their habitat can be very different in the wintering ranges in India. Though apparently that's not the same elsewhere in the world, like in Africa or in extreme parts of Southeast Asia. But olive-backed pipits, in my experience, so in summers, both of them breed above the tree line. There's actually a subspecies of tree pipit that does breed in India in Northwest Kashmir, but we'll forget that for a while because they look the same. But in the summer, they both breed above tree level. They in open grasslands and things like that. But in the winters, they have very different wintering preferences for as far as habitats are concerned. So, for example, olive-backed pipit, they really prefer areas with canopy. So a dense tree cover. So in Delhi, the Buddha Jayanti Park, Hoskas, JNU, all of these campuses, they have really good habitat for olive-backed pipits. And tree pipits, in contrast, like these open habitats, fields, but often on the edge of like some trees, like in a canal, like how one place which is very good for tree pipits would be, for example, in the canals at Degal in Rohtak. You have this canal, and then you have a line of trees along the canal, and then open fields next to it. You will often find tree pipits on the fringes of those fields, but they prefer these open fields to feed on. And in parts of like in Manipal, where I would see tree pipits, you would have completely open fields and no cover even, and they would only perch on wires and then go back into the grass. So tree pipits in general prefer these open habitats, even open woodlands, like dry scrub kind of habitat, while olive-backed pipit likes these shaded canopied areas. One trick I used to tell photographers was that if you're taking a shot of an olive-backed pipit or a tree pipit looking up, if it's got a blue sky at the back, it's likely to be a tree pipit, and if it's got a green background, then it's likely to be an olive-backed pipit. But probably take that with a pinch of salt. Though I still reckon it'll be true 60 to 70% of the times. We'll go on to another very common pipit in Delhi, especially actually all across the alluvial plain, the Gangetic belt, and all into the northeast, wherever there are nice damp reed beds and marshes and grasslands, is the Rosy Pipit. And again, a very cool looking pipit. I really like these birds. They look very different, of course, in breeding plumage and non-breeding plumage. They have distinct plumages. Supposedly, so in the breeding plumage, they get this rosy breast, the pinkish wash to the breast, which is what gives them their name. You can apparently tell between males and females, because if there's absolutely no streaking on the breast, then it's likely to be a male. If there's strong streaking on the flanks in the middle of the breeding season, it's likely to be a female. So this might actually be a female. I've never actually tested this in the field. I only found out recently. So might try it out next time. But where we see them, let's say around Delhi, or in the, in Maguri Beal or Kaziranga or wherever you go for your winter birding, you're likely to see them in this plumage. A really heavily streaked bird, heavily streaked back, heavily streaked breast, really long supercilium, and that's a standout feature of this species. We'll come to the other birds, but it has by far the longest supercilium. It goes all the way down to the ear coverts, actually, sometimes in a single line. Sometimes there's a slight break over here, and then there are white spots down to the ear coverts, the back end of the ear coverts. One thing that really stands out for me in this bird, and I'm colorblind, and even I can always see it, even in the field, is they have a lot of olive on the wings, kind of like a Siberian chiffchaff has. So when you see these birds, you have this very streaky brown bird and a bright patch of olive on the flight feathers. It is really cool. And I have found that to be a very reliable ID feature. Unfortunately, you don't get them in South India. So Delhi is probably the best place to see them, but all across this belt is really good Rosy Pipit belt. I know there are birds that get to Gujarat, there are birds that get to Maharashtra, but that's about it. I think I could be wrong, but don't worry about it. You can look at range maps later. Another very gorgeous pipit is a red-throated pipit. One really cool thing. So I think for the longest time I thought these birds were breeding plumage and non-breeding plumage, but apparently the plumage you see has to do with age as opposed to the season. Again, in breeding has to do with the age. So immatures look like this. So juveniles have this completely plain, no red on the breast or the throat. A really streaky bird, really strong streaks on the back, strong streaks down the bottom. And not all females, it seems, even after maturing and becoming adults, reach this plumage, this completely red-breasted plumage. So you can see females like this. So this might be an immature or a female. Note how there's some red on the breast. Often there's just red on the throat as well. And then this is an adult male. Has a completely red throat and red going down to the breast with streaks on the flanks. Very distinctive pipit again. I'm just going to go back to Rosy Pipit because I realized something else that's pretty important is the bill is really black. And I'll come to that later because this bird is often confused with, it's probably most similar of the streaky small pipits to the to the red-throated pipit. And they're also found in similar habitats, where there's normally damp wetlands essentially. And so there's red-throated pipit A doesn't have as long a supercilium or as obvious a supercilium as Rosy Pipit does. Doesn't have the olive on the wings, and always has this yellow to the base of the bill, as opposed to the dark jet black bill of the the Rosy Pipit that stands out. Their habitat is very similar, but red-throated pipit is far rarer anywhere in India except for maybe the Andamans. So it's pretty common here, especially. I know a lot of people probably see them at Sippy Ghat. It's probably the easiest place to see them. But there are records often from Basai and things around Delhi. There are records from the Northeast. And I know Mike Prince had a bunch of regular birds at Heselgata, which have since been seen a few times as well. So they seem to wander fairly far. There are records from Gujarat and Kerala as well. So they're fairly widespread, but generally rare, I suppose, because they're not seen that often. The next bird is a buff-bellied pipit. Now I'll quickly run through these because these are just rare birds, frankly. Buff-bellied pipit, again, in breeding plumage, looks like this. In non-breeding plumage, looks like this. We normally see it looking like this. I think most of us have seen these birds either at Pong, or I think when the bunch was being seen regularly at Talchapar or something. Talchapar or was it Desert National Park? One of those two, or maybe both. But the standout feature for this bird to me, especially non-breeding plumage, is the fact that the back remains completely unstreaked. It's a very washed out, very plain back, very short supercilium. So from above, it's actually a very plain looking bird. And then suddenly below, it has this really dark necklace, really dark patches, even in the breeding plumage on the Mellar. The Mellar stripe basically becomes this really dense dark patch and then goes all the way down as streaks down to the belly. There are breeding birds that don't often show this. And in that case, it can look very similar to in breeding plumage to the next bird that we see, which is the water pipit, but it's got very different tones to the plumage overall. So in either way, I don't think we'll see one in India in breeding plumage. So what I look for is essentially the short supercilium, plain back, very dark malar region, and the streaking going down the underparts. Right. Stop drawing, please. Thank you. So I think buff-bellied pipits have regularly been recorded from Pong and probably Talchapar. I know there's a record from Maguri Beal. So again, fairly widespread, but they breed in the far east corner of Russia and in Alaska. So I think the birds that come down to India take this route, and so you end up seeing them in this kind of belt essentially. So they come like this and like that, and we are probably on the extreme end of its range. Right. Last bird, promise, is the water pipit. Again, a very delightful bird and probably more common than we think it is in India. Has a very distinctive call, pink, pink, as they fly through. It's a very nasal, very different to any other pipit call that you listen to. I've forgotten if it's pink, something like that. It sounds very wheezy, very nasal. And the easiest way, they tell you at least is to identify them is the black bill and the black legs, which is a really good combination, kind of like our chip-chap. It's very plain also, has very vague streaking on the back like this, very vague streaking on the front like that. But as you can see from Kavi's bird over here, there are birds which show yellow bases to the bill. One thing to note in all these pipits is, maybe if you want from a distance, one of the easier ways to tell is Rosy Pipit has this black lores, red-throated has black lores in its juvenile plumage, and buff-bellied doesn't has pale lores, and what pipit also has pale lores usually. But either way, this group superficially looks fairly similar, but in the field you'll notice they're easier to tell apart if you look at the right things than they appear. Again, water pipits very ridiculously common around Pong, regular around Basai. I finally made my way to Netsi in Desert National Park, I think a couple of years ago, and I was surprised to find that they were the common pipit in that region. So I'm pretty sure there are small wetlands and places where they're regular and probably very common throughout the winter season. Just a short guide to these pipits. Rosy Pipit, again, I think this combination here is is a pretty good giveaway. So between rosy and red-throated, they have strong streaking on both sides of the body, but the lores and the supercilium actually is the easiest way to tell them apart in that case. Buff-bellied and water pipit. Buff-bellied has weak back streaking, strong breast streaking, but water pipit has weak in these cases. So I mean, they're straightforward, and yeah, I don't expect, if you get a good photo or a good look of one, you won't have trouble identifying it. Cool. Thanks to everyone. I would like to clarify, I didn't ask a lot of the photographers whom I borrowed images from, but I hope they wouldn't mind. And so, yeah, thanks to all of those photographers as well who I did take images from. And thanks to all of you for being patient and kind and attending this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramit. That was fantastic. And for bringing some color into these little brown birds for us. And we should hopefully look at them more carefully now.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think you're always in the danger of oversimplifying things when you're trying to describe these difficult birds. But if you've seen a pipit in the field, I say all these things, like look at the lores, but they move like this. So it's completely okay if you don't know what you're seeing 50% of the time. Although it's likely to be a paddy field pipit most of the time anyway. But yeah.
Easier said than done, all the little brown birds.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, and thanks everybody for logging on, and do keep tuned in. We have great talks coming up in the next few weekends. We have larks, we have sandpipers, we have migration, we have raptors. So thank you everybody, and see you next weekend. Thanks, Ramit.
Cheers.